Hello and welcome. You're with us here on the Global Reset on CNBC TV 18 Prime with me, Prashant Nair. Well, before we go into our discussion topic, which I must say is an extremely interesting one and a very timely one at that, let me begin by marking what seems to be renewed attempts by US President Trump as he sort of escalates his tariff campaign. In the latest announcement, he said that he is planning to impose a 50% duty on copper imports as part of a set of looming sectoral tariffs, while threatening a crippling 200% levy on pharmaceutical imports, foreign-made pharmaceutical products. However, he said drug makers, that is pharma companies, would be given about a year to get their act together.
Ones we did steel, as you know, they're 50%. We did aluminum, 50%. Lumber just came out.
Why don't you announce copper?
And we did cars. And now, today we're doing copper.
Copper and lumber. What would that tariff be on? The sectional tariff?
I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
50%.
And we'll be announcing something very soon on pharmaceuticals. We're going to give people about a year and a half to come in, and after that they're going to be tariffed if they have to bring the pharmaceuticals into the country, the drugs and other things into the country. They're going to be tariffed at a very, very high rate, like 200%. We'll give them a certain period of time to get their act together. But they were all here, now they all left. They went to other places because we allowed, people that sat in this room allowed it to happen. And I don't allow it to happen. The people in this room don't allow it to happen.
Well, that is President Trump. In a world where global trade dynamics are shifting at breakneck speed and the specter of tariffs and de-dollarization loom large, few voices carry as much weight as Jim O'Neill, the economist who coined the term BRIC, that is B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the architect of a concept that redefined emerging markets. O'Neill's perspective is more relevant than ever amid escalating trade tensions. Now, in this exclusive interview, we will go beyond the headlines to challenge O'Neill on the toughest questions facing global investors and policymakers today. Well, is the BRICS alliance truly equipped to weather a new era of protectionism? How credible are threats of sweeping US tariffs, and what would retaliation look like? Can China and India ever align closely enough to rival US financial dominance? And is the dream of a BRICS common currency a genuine possibility or just political theater? Well, let's hear from the man himself, Donald Trump, as he reiterated that a 10% tariff threat for the BRICS, claiming that the bloc was set to hurt the US dollar. Take a look.
They have to pay 10% if they're in BRICS, because BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir, or is
Yeah,
that
pretty
if
soon.
they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff, just for that one thing, and they won't be a member long. I thought BRICS was, you know, I said this about a year ago, and it largely broke up. But, you know, there are a couple that hang around, but I thought it largely broke up. BRICS is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat. But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar so that another country can take over and be the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard.
Jim, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think this is a very, very timely conversation amid sort of today's renewed trade tensions, the specter of a new tariff war under Trump. Do you believe, Jim, that the BRICS bloc can maintain unity? Or will internal economic divergences be exposed under pressure and under the spotlight which President Trump is throwing on the trade bloc? Go on.
That's a very wide and broad and deep question to start with, but I'll try and give you a succinct answer. It's very nice to be with you. To be really honest, firstly, each time Trump says something about the BRICS, I'm both amused and even more confused than I am when he talks about many other topics. I sometimes wonder whether he actually really knows who's part of the BRICS and who isn't. For example, if you think about it deeply, so far, since he advanced the case for tariffs, Trump appears to have been really careful about not applying any new tariffs to Russia, for example, who are arguably the most vocal member of the BRICS in terms of big statements about supposed intent. So how does that kind of fit? And I could give many other examples, but more broadly, what I find, and I think this is the fourth time Trump has mentioned the BRICS, but by making the kind of threats that he does, it effectively gives them more substance as a group than I actually think evidence warrants, as you and I have talked about in the past, and I'd say quite frequently in recent years. The BRICS political group's largest impact is really symbolic in terms of correctly, constantly highlighting the woeful state of global governance and how underrepresented they are. But in terms of actually jointly really achieving things together, in my judgment, the BRICS haven't really done anything. So I'm not sure Trump's statement ultimately is going to mean one thing or another of any great relevance, other than the fact it gives the BRICS greater attention, which I would have thought is the last thing that Trump was trying to do, or should have intended. But such is the strange world of life under Donald Trump.
We've had all, but Jim, absolutely, and I think that's great context. But he has threatened, 10% additional tariffs last night for anybody who's part of BRICS, 100% tariffs on BRICS countries if they pursue de-dollarization or a common currency. So there's no plan, but there are these threats, right? How credible are these threats, and do you see it sort of as a genuine deterrent or more of a political gesturing?
Really, no. It's not a very gratifying answer to some ways for your viewers. But on both sides of that, there's not a lot of ground for these things to be taken seriously. First of all, to continue on the inconsistency about his tariff threats, at the time we're conducting this interview, there is enormous attention again on the Middle East. And many scholars of the Middle East think that his main ultimate goal is to try and expand the so-called Abraham Accords, of which Saudi Arabia is absolutely key. And the whole idea that he would apply some tariffs to Saudi Arabia, which of course are sort of friends of the BRICS, and I'm not sure if they're fully signed up to being part of BRICS Plus, but the UAE are part of the BRICS Plus. It just sort of how does that fit with his other goals? And then more importantly, the more substantive point is the whole idea that the BRICS countries can realistically jointly develop some alternative currency to the dollar just doesn't really make much sense whatsoever. I've spent much of my professional life developing my years during the build-up and the creation of the euro. And everybody knows the difficulties that European countries went through, but it ultimately, of course, required them to abandon their own domestic monetary policies and to give up the importance of their own central banks. And the whole idea that big BRICS countries are going to abandon their central banks for some kind of joint initiative on currency, it's like some kind of fantasy Netflix movie, really. I can't, famous last words, anything in life is possible, but I can't really see any serious grounds for some kind of joint BRICS currency.
Good points there. Now, you've called BRICS, as you said, BRICS' de-dollarization ambitions unrealistic. But it is also true that if there's one area where other currencies, apart from the dollar, is being used as oil, oil is being bought using the yuan, a lot of it, increasingly so. So it may not be a structured or planned thing, this moving away from the dollar, but it is happening. What do you make of it? And of course, this is what President Trump is worried about as well.
So now I will contradict myself, even though I think it's very unlikely that there's going to be some kind of BRICS currency as such. What does seem to me inevitable over coming decades or maybe years, we'll only ever know with hindsight, is that the dollar will not remain anything like as dominant as the world's so-called reserve currency in the future that it's been for most of my lifetime. And it's very difficult for life to develop any way other than that, ultimately, because unless you remain such a powerfully dominant economy in the world, ultimately you can't be the main benchmark around which the world's monetary system develops. And it's as difficult and as simple as that. The UK was for a long time the world's major reserve currency, and from what I can read in history books, the pound lived on as being the dominant currency for a few decades after the UK clearly stopped being so dominant in the world economy. And so I don't see anything other than that likelihood for the US ultimately. Now, the key point to really, your viewers for now is this is a contradiction inside Trump's head. Clearly, he doesn't like the idea of people talking about the dollar losing its reserve currency status, but he's presiding over policies which effectively invite investors all over the world to search for alternatives to the dollar. When you have a president questioning all the independent legal and institutional framework of things in the United States, whether it be aspects of the court system and, of course, crucially to the currency, the independence of the central bank and its president, never mind these inconsistencies about applying very aggressive tariffs all over the world, expanding dramatically their own domestic fiscal deficits, and somehow then worrying and making aggressive statements about remaining the reserve currency. It's again certainly amusing, but full of inconsistencies. And it's not surprising to me that the dollar has weakened this year in the way that it has. And go right back to last November, I was rather surprised as to how the sort of consensus Wall Street view that Trump would be bullish for the dollar, when it seems to me pretty obvious the opposite would be the case. The big question is, how can the other alternative reserve currencies, which here I tend to agree with the consensus view, are essentially the RMB, the Chinese renminbi, and the euro, how can they cope in their own domestic capital markets with inflows that are trying to not be so dominant in the dollar? But I think that's the reality in which we live, and where I would disagree with what I observe as the consensus thinking. Actually, the inflows themselves and the capital going into these places might actually influence the policymakers in Europe and China to do more to allow their currency to actually provide some of this reserve currency status.
Well, I think that's such a nice contrast that you've drawn, right? Trump's actions himself leading to lower dollar, people looking for other assets, and at the same time, President Trump worrying about de-dollarization. Really interesting thoughts there. What we'll do, Jim, is take a quick commercial break here. Allow us to do that. We will continue this conversation. On the other side, we'll bring in India as well. What are your thoughts about, the opportunities which India provides? Stay tuned. Welcome back to CNBC TV 18 Prime. You're watching the Global Reset. We are in conversation with a man who termed the acronym BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Of course, it's BRICS now with South Africa in there. And the reason we're talking about this now, of course, is President Trump lashing out against this BRIC grouping. Jim O'Neill, of course, is the person who coined BRIC as an acronym. He's with us. Jim, thanks for waiting. What do you make of President Trump's tariff strategy? We've seen letters being sent out, which are largely the same as what we saw on the Liberation Day, except, of course, the starting date, which is now new, which is August 1st. What do you make of this in terms of the impact for investors, and what should the read-through be? There's so much noise, but what's really the signal here?
So on the tariff letters. I think the way the markets are assuming this 12 hours later, and who knows, the markets might change. But effectively, the markets are thinking what it's really done is delay decision day again, because the extension to August the 1st is probably the most important new bit of news that we've seen. And if you look at the reaction of markets, it's pretty modest so far. However, the broader point is that he is applying tariffs at a pretty dramatically raised rates from those that existed at the start of this year. And I'm sufficiently conventional in my economic thinking in this regard that these are not going to be effective, which I'll come back to as to what the goals are, in achieving the presumed goals that sits behind it, unless there is a deliberate effort to raise the domestic US savings rates. Because in a world where the balance of payments of any country is always zero, your trade and current account deficit is the automatic reflection of the net capital inflow, and both of which relate to a country's domestic savings and investment imbalance. So unless the US can raise more money, it is going to need foreign capital, which by definition means it will keep, broadly speaking, the same aggregate trade and current account deficit as share of GDP, even if the bits differ with different countries. So it's a bit of a fallacy that you can change these important fundamental imbalances just by simply applying tariffs, unless, and this goes to the purpose, unless you are in a more subtle way, and subtlety doesn't seem to be something that goes well with Trump, but maybe we'll find out ultimately that this is his deeper brilliance, that he is more subtle than any of us realized, that you are deliberately trying to weaken the US consumer permanently. Because the way to really achieve what appears to be the goal and the pact that Trump has with the middle and working classes of America, that is his real support base, is this sort of notion that they're going to recreate manufacturing jobs and greater value-added employment in the United States. And the only way that that can be permanently achieved is by raising domestic savings and permanently reducing consumption as a share of GDP. But of course, in saying that, as I'm sure many of your viewers will respond to, isn't that the opposite of what Trump supporters seem to think? And I don't know where this is going to end in terms of the trust, the deepness of trust that many of Trump's supporters seem to have, because there's so many inconsistencies in there. Final thing to say, however, is it does look to me as though Trump has a very different geopolitical vision than has been conventional thinking, again, for much of my lifetime. And I just actually published something about this via Project Syndicate, because it goes right back to the start of the BRICS. If you think at the recent G7 meeting, where Trump barely stayed there for a couple of hours, he made a very interesting comment about how he thought the G7 should be adjusted and Russia should never have been kicked out, and maybe China should be part of it. And if people go back and read the first piece I wrote about the BRICS, it was all about global governance and how the G7 should be expanded to include each of the four BRICS. And so that seems to me to be actually not a crazy idea from Trump compared to many of his other ideas, albeit one that challenges so much Western conventional thinking. But if we're going to try and solve truly global challenges, whether they be infectious diseases or climate change or true complex global cooperation, we can't continue with a world where you have the G7 sitting in one corner trying to pretend that they can solve the world's problems, and the BRICS countries, going back to where we started, sitting in another corner trying to pretend that they can. And you need to have both of them around the table together.
Got that, Nabs. I think such a fundamentally important point that you make there. After everything is said and done, just to stick to tariffs for one bit longer, and this is a bit of a googly, what will average US tariff rates finally settle at? Will it be 10, 15, 20?
That is a really very specific, tough question that I would love to duck. You know, unless the US is essentially really coming to the subtle judgment that it must deliberately lower its consumption patterns compared to the ones that have presided throughout the modern US culture and society for the past 40 years. I don't believe the current tariff rates, never mind higher ones, can be sustained for too long, because all they will achieve will be to, through relative price changes, suppress real incomes in the US. And that is not what either side of the political aisle, in this strange way that US politics is evolving, it's not the way that US leaders are trying to tell American people life is about in the future, because it's not really at the core of making America great again. And so, what I think eventually would be more logical, and one always has to be careful to not confuse what you would like with what will happen, but somehow the US needs to sort of, I'd almost call it Scandinavianize itself, in which it has to find a way of having higher public spending, unless it's going to savagely cut things like Medicare and health spending, or raise taxes quite a bit more. And of course, a bit like we find in my own country, in the UK, and one or two others, we're living in an era where populist politicians just like to tell the voting public mythical things they like to hear, that they sort of pretend they can have all these goodies and they don't have to pay any more tax for it. But that's not the world of reality. And I think at some point, some leader of the US is either going to choose or have it forced upon them by Congress to deal with the more complex underlying realities that are at the core of America's actual and psychological challenges at this moment in time.
Jim, your views on India, and I think that's something that our audiences would want to wait to hear from you as well. The optimism that India is going to be a big winner in the spat between India and China has been dulled a little bit. It's down 1 or 2 notches because of the kind of hot and cold negotiations that India and US have had. I mean, India was supposed to be first in line to get a deal. But fundamentally and over the medium term, what is your view? Will India emerge as a big winner out of all of this?
Yeah, I sort of, as I've done for 30 years, I find myself quite easily changing my mind about aspects of the Indian story every other day. But with that caveat, I do think India is in a very uniquely strong position of big countries in the world, in that, of course, it sits comfortably as one of the key BRIC nations. So it has the respect of so many other parts of the so-called global south, and many of those countries very happy to do more business, including trade with India. But at the same time, and it's quite clever or maybe just great luck of the Modi government, that at the same time, every one of the G7 countries wants to do business with India too. And it plays this sort of China-US sort of spat or era of disagreement pretty well. And I think all of that, crucially on top of what, of course, is India's biggest fundamental current global advantage, is that it's got quite a few more years, certainly probably a decade, if not a bit more, of the urbanization process that China went through so powerfully, that drove so much of its huge growth performance from the 1990s through to the middle of the last decade. And you see that with the improved way that India is delivering much of its own infrastructure, and to my slight surprise, but when I read it, it kind of makes sense through time, ranking higher in some of these indices of top global universities and so on. And so all of that with the demographics do give India this growth rate that's one of the envies of most other countries in the world. So I think all of that is a very powerful thing for India to advantage, and of course the Indian equity market for many years has effectively reflected all those things. The dilemma, as investors always face at any moment in time, is how much of all of this relative advantage and good news is priced in, and how realistic are some of the key things about making the next step. And as you've touched on with that question, the trade negotiations between India and the US aren't going as smoothly as I think many Indians around the Prime Minister hoped. I remember meeting some very senior officials earlier this year, and at the turn of the year, and they were very hopeful that India would be the first in line for a favourable deal, and it doesn't look like that. So that needs to be taken on board. But of course there are other challenges too. India, it's one thing to think that from a relative price perspective, India could benefit if China gets higher tariffs and is sort of eased out of global markets that give India a chance. But India has to develop the ability of its manufacturing and services workforce to offer the same kind of global edge that China did in that remarkable 30-year, if not longer period that just sort of transformed aspects of world production. And I think India has a chance, but it has to keep pushing at making its labour markets and its capital markets and other markets domestically become more competitive and more efficient. But there's a lot of good signs, and that's why India is such a key part of this changing dynamic world economy and complex world economy in which we're living through.
Jim, I can't thank you enough. Thank you very much for joining us on this program. And I hope you will join us on, of course, the BRICS issue, which I'm sure is not going away anytime soon. And of course, all that is happening with regards to President Trump's tariffs and the impact thereof. I hope this is the first of many conversations. Well, thanks again. It's a wrap on this edition of the Global Reset. Thank you for being with us here on CNBC TV 18 Prime. Programming continues on the other side.